you all for coming to this second global roundtable that we've planned. We've got 3 in the works. So first one was a great success. And so I hope this one, and I'm sure this one will be as well. My name is Dustin Byrd. I'm an associate professor of philosophy, religion, and Arabic at Olivet College in Michigan. And so I thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Syed Miri for doing a lot of the legwork to get this to go through. He is a blessing in this world. So I'm very happy he could be here.
Thank you very much.
So as far as the format, as we go along, each presenter has about 15 to 20 minutes to do their presentation, give or take. You know, we're going to save questions for the end. We'll have an opportunity to talk to each other and discuss these whole things towards the end. All right. With that, do we have someone who wants to go first?
Yeah, we go with maybe Mehdi.
Okay, sure. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this group, and I'm hoping that I can learn more than I've been in the past meetings. Frankly, I'm not sure about the platform, about the content of the meeting today. Is my understanding that we're going to talk about perhaps colonial or post-colonial theory, relocating, extracting the resources that exist within the colonial area or non-colonial area outside of the West. And if that's the case, then what I would like to do is to maybe talk about an outline of what I would like to do. And I've been doing some work on this, and that is the debate that is raging on still between Marxists on the one hand about the nature of global system and the relationship historically and contemporaneously, and the post-colonial theory / cultural studies / subaltern theory, and mostly, of course, from the latter, mostly from the Indian continent and Africa, and some in the Middle East. And then, of course, I would like to add a third dimension that is really not discussed, and that is Ali Shariati, whose thoughts and ideas I'm somewhat familiar with. And the idea of return to a self, an authentic self. In other words, Marxists have an explanation as to how the global system works or has been working from the early Marx and all the, in reality, Western philosophy, whether they had this paternalistic attitude toward non-Western or in many ways were apologetic in terms of colonial activities around the world, or they were hopeful, perhaps. And I think in some cases you can see that in the case of Marx, you see somehow colonialism, particularly in the case of India, as something maybe beneficial, because then it would hasten the development of proletariat that eventually would lead to revolution. And of course, the other Western philosophers, they thought it was really the Western duty of the West to civilize, the civilizing mission, and we're all familiar with that somehow colonialism was a blessing for the non-Western world. And then from Marxism in particular, and of course from meta-theoretical arguments of others, contemporaries of Marx and others, we've seen theories. But in Marxist theories of empiricism, they are looking at the development of global capitalism in relation to not only the center, but also to the rest of the world, the periphery, the satellites. And for the most part, those theories tend to concentrate on the extraction of resources. That is, going in there, extracting resources. And of course, different empires have used different strategies to successfully extract the resources. Force was not always, at the on top of the agenda. However, that was used frequently. But cultural alienation, perhaps the creation of an image of a non-Western that was pitiful, it was not good, wasn't worthy of anything, couldn't do anything, that it was up to the West to come and rescue. And so, and then we see the development of world system theory, dependency theory, also wonderful explanations of the global capitalism and global economic system and how it impacts the peripheral regions. In particular, I'm thinking of Latin America, dependency theory. But all of these, in terms of concrete action as to how to overcome, it seems that they reach a dead end. I don't know of any concrete proposal on the part of dependency and others, except the Ferdinand Cardoso, who decided that the only way to change the system, this center-periphery relationship, is to join the establishment, the political establishment within the periphery. And sure enough, he became president of Brazil for 2 terms. But then again, the end result, of course, wasn't something that he was hoping for, or maybe the fact that he was part of the political establishment that he was in many ways could not accomplish what he believed was possible to accomplish. Now, in the case of the return to self or self-consciousness, Ali Shariati promoted the idea of consciousness raising as a responsibility of every individual in society, but more importantly, self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, that is the critical part, that we have to know ourselves before we can resort to any kind of action. We have to decide what, we have to know about our history. We have to have a direction, more importantly. I think some of these issues were developed by the wonderful work that Syed Jawad did, Ali Shariati expanding the sociological canon. And that's self-awareness or raising consciousness, of course, means that we have to look at our own history and cultural resources. In fact, he has a lecture, he did a lecture on the University of Abadan, which is the refinery center of Iran and the oil-rich region of Iran. And the title of his presentation was the extraction and refinement of cultural resources. Now, that was just one of the component of his overall approach to raising consciousness, self-consciousness in particular. He really was annoyed by the fact that there was so much reliance on Western literature as a legitimizing resource, meaning that it seems that we had to constantly resort to quoting and citing Western resources, cultural resources, philosophical, sociological, social sciences, in order to legitimate, in order to validate our own argument. And so his argument that we do have the resources here. And I'm not sure that this is unique to Iran. In fact, he believed, and one of these argument against Fanon's notion that somehow, for instance, religion was irrelevant or could not accomplish much by way of defeating colonialism, was that no, religion can provide. Just look at how what kind of role religion plays in societies like Iran. But then the question, of course, his question is, then we have to ask ourselves, what religion? What type of religion? Therefore, he also, as part of the extraction and refinement of cultural resources, he is recalling the authentic Islamic concepts. Just about that, he believed that just about every part of society was subject to that. We had to remove centuries of abuse and centuries of abuse in the hands of the political establishment, official religious establishments, and also the fact that colonial powers, outside forces, outside interests have every reason to the status quo, that is, relying on powerful forces within society to facilitate the exploitation of native economy and society. So in other words, we have to have, first you got to have the stupefaction, this istihmar, that is, you create an environment that people are people's ability to think is removed from them. Once you have that, of course, then it's very easy to control them politically and exploit them economically. So this is something I've been working as a sort of a third dimension, and I agree with that Marxism has something to offer. Post-colonial theory has something to offer, but today it seems most of the energies are spent going against each other. If you look at the debate between the post-colonial subaltern and Marxism on the one hand, it is back and forth. And so the question is, what is to be done? And again, in most of these, by the way, post-colonial arguments from Syed, which I think is perhaps well-known, one of the most well-known theoreticians, discussing Orientalism, to other parts of the world in Africa, Achebe and others, cultural studies and departments and major universities, and but what is the methodology? What's the research agenda? Where are we going with all of this? I think that's the question we need to ask. That's why Ali Shariati becomes so critical, in that he constantly emphasizes direction. What direction? What is it that you want to accomplish? Where are you going to go with it? Then you decide. I think decolonizing methodologies also needs to be expanded upon. How do we come up with authentic methodologies, research context, which are not repeat in terms of variables, in terms of direction and subject matter. Anyway, I'm not sure I have anything else, but as we go through our questions and answers, maybe I can clarify a few things just in case. It's not. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mehdi. Thank you. That was very good. Okay, Syed Javed, you're the one who appoints people, so you get to dictate.
Yeah, no. Thank you.
You know your power. You have it.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. Actually, the point you mentioned about the difference between Fanon and Shariati, I think is one of those issues which could be discussed either in this roundtable or even later on, because this is one of the things about religion. When he comes and says, Ali Shariati points to Fanon and says, actually, religion is going to unite the people of the East. But it seems Fanon maybe was more perceptive about that. It seems religion hasn't been able to unite people. It has been a dismissive or maybe a disuniting force as well. Here, I think there is a point which we could later on discuss. Thank you very much, Mehdi. Now, because you mentioned something about post-colonial and the debates between like post-colonial theories and Marxist and decolonial, for example, theories. I think here we go to Kerstin. I'm sure she has a lot to offer today. The floor is yours, Kerstin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Syed. I'm the first time here in your exclusive roundtable, and I think maybe Syed invited me because he knows I do some studies in post-colonial theory, also on Marxism, and on epistemological power relations.
And we
so Syed, did you tell everyone about the book?
No, I haven't said that, but we have actually done. It's good now you brought it up. I received the book actually 2 weeks ago. This is one.
Very good.
We have.
That's it. Turn it around.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. We have to thank Kerstin and Detlef. We had Detlef in the last roundtable. This was actually on the 200 years anniversary of Karl Marx. Kerstin and Detlef organized this beautiful conference in Bremen, in Germany. And finally, I received it here. Yes.
Yeah. What's the title? I didn't see, I couldn't see the
Oh,
title.
yeah, I will tell you, from Marx to global Marxism, Eurocentrism, resistance, post-colonial criticism.
Those are all the titles?
Yeah.
Right, right.
Part of the title, okay.
Yeah,
Does that
from
help?
Marx to global Marxism.
Okay,
Doesn't-
thank you.
Yeah, you'll find it. And
I will buy it.
yeah,
You can just
Very
write
good.
in the chat title of it.
yeah. Say, can you do that? Because yeah, I have to speak. And well, to me, I know about the debates between Marxism and post-colonial criticism, and I don't endorse these debates because to me, you have to integrate Marxism with post-colonial criticism in order to assess and, you know, critique the states of our post-colonial worlds. And you know, lots of critics don't see a difference here. I just think about the the subaltern studies group coming from India with Gayatri Spivak and Ranjit Guha, I think, and they were all Marxists, and they knew their Marx, and they were, you know, looking at the world with a very Marxist and, you know, post-colonial critical viewpoint. And my approach is similar to that. And what we did in a conference, we were trying to bring into the debate voices from the non-Western world on Marxism, like reassessing Marx again from, you know, 200 years later, from the viewpoint of different so-called non-Western or non-Northern knowledge systems or ideological backgrounds. And that's where, you know, Syed was giving a talk and a contribution on Shariati. And we had contributions from Turkey and contributions from India and so forth. And so this kind of was reassessing Karl Marx from a post-colonial perspective. And I think that, yeah, it's a quite nice book. But what I do also is I'm a professor for North American and post-colonial literatures and cultures at the University of Bremen. And within post-colonial studies, I focus on several areas. And number one is indigenous and post-colonial films worldwide. The second topic is German colonialism in the Pacific. The third one is epistemological power relations and post-colonial knowledges. And my fourth biggest subject is what we call blue humanities, or the studies of oceans in the fields of post-colonial studies, literatures, films, and marine cultures. And today I would like to talk a little bit about epistemological power relations and post-colonial knowledge systems, which is also, you know, one major field of research for me. And it ties in very beautifully with what Mehdi Shariati has just said about, you know, in colonial times and also post-colonial times, you know, people were always looking to Western sources in order to legitimate non-European knowledges. And, you know, this goes back to, you know, the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge systems since colonialism. And for me, it is very important to critically study epistemological power relations and the worldwide dominance of Eurocentric knowledges and knowledge practices. And this omnipresent Eurocentric educational system that has been exported through colonialism into the world. And now, regardless whether or not you have somebody, you know, graduating from Dakar University or from Argentina or from the United States or from Germany, we all have similar knowledge system. And, you know, what you study within your field is all, you know, Eurocentric based, basically, because through colonialism, we have exported European knowledges and they have become established as the standard knowledge systems and the non plus ultra knowledge that has to be studied. And then, of course, that colonial practice has marginalized or very often simply ignored or even destroyed the local knowledges and the local knowledge practices that have been around, whether in Africa or in India or somewhere else. So to me, engaging with post-colonial knowledges means thinking from the margins and asking inconvenient questions. And these might be, why is it that when we think of knowledge, only Eurocentric or so-called Western or Northern knowledge comes to mind? Why is it that a recent article on contemporary philosophy mentions a list of Eurocentric or Western philosophers, but ignores philosophy practiced in Africa, native North America, in the Middle East, or in India? Why is it that schools, universities, and other educational institutes throughout the world operate solely according to Eurocentric norms, standards, and practices? For example, what is considered as knowledge? How do we transmit knowledge? How successful education is examined? And how do we recognize a knowledgeable person? Do we have to have, a university degree? Or is, an Inuit hunter also a professor of the Arctic in a sense, right? Do we, are we ready to see also people with other knowledges as knowledgeable people? And all that together is something that, I'm very interested in. So thinking about post-colonial knowledges means critically assessing the historical and present domination and appropriation of the world's knowledge systems through a ubiquitous European intellectual tradition. It means accounting for this intellectual dominance, as Laura Emigwali has termed it, or coloniality of knowledge, as Walter Mignolo has termed it, or cognitive imperialism, as Marie Baptiste, indigenous Cree a scholar, has termed it. Because we need to account for this dominance of European knowledge systems through European colonialism, where colonial histories emerged as destined trajectories that reordered the world, and then they generated naturalized cultural hierarchies and all-encompassing epistemologies that are rooted in the Greco-Romanian worlds and thinking, and they are based on Western logocentrism and Cartesian dualism. And there are lots of contradictions as well in this field, because political modernity, as we all know, is unthinkable without concepts such as citizenship, human rights, equality, democracy, solidarity, as you talk about, and scientific rationality. And these are ideas born in the European Enlightenment. And these concepts have helped to critique Western capitalism and colonialism. And yet the Enlightenment and Enlightenment humanism did not include non-European people in its understanding of man, right? Because as Spivak has so beautifully said, the image of the man in the philosophy proper is the settler colonial white man, right? And it excludes the African man, the African woman, and so forth. And this is what Mignolo would call the coloniality of knowledge. So in consequence, basic contradictions and oppositions in terms of knowledge and knowledge production turn on historical power relations, the Orientalist practice of creating normative discourses about the self and the other, and on the displacement of traditional educational practices with an omnipresent Eurocentric educational system that, of course, is still in place throughout the world. The Western Academy assigns primacy to knowledge that is based on reason, on logic, on science, and empirical proof, and it very often excludes knowledges that are based on observation, oral tradition, digressive thinking, and even the spiritual. And very often indigenous and post-colonial knowledges are associated with the latter categories. And that's why this Western logic suggests these post-colonial knowledges cannot belong to the legitimate materialistic world of true or serious science, reason, and logic. And accordingly, post-colonial and indigenous and local knowledges have been very often viewed as primitive, as folkloric, anecdotal, unscientific, and insignificant. And studying all these phenomena and kind of illuminating what are post-colonial knowledges, what is the richness or the wealth that non-European knowledges are bringing to the world and are bringing to our thinking, that is something that I'm interested in. And that means, of course, also, looking at African philosophy, Iranian philosophy, and Native American philosophy, and so forth. But I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What you said about the political, actually, post-colonial knowledge system, this is something actually we could even ponder upon and discuss later on in the Q&A. Thank you very much. Okay, now we go to Daniel. Hello, Daniel. If I pronounce it right.
Yeah, it's hello, everybody. In Italian we say Daniele, but it's Daniele is fine. I mean, it's the same.
Thank you very much.
And so thank you for this invitation. I was really thrilled by the possibility of joining. We met once 4 years ago in Tehran.
Yes.
And I would like to take this conversation back. So I'm basically trying to work on social sciences in the Arab world. So I'm an anthropologist, and I'm very glad that Kerstin just mentioned this, because it's I share her observation that we are all, I mean, this educational system became very much globalized. And so wherever we're talking about Indonesia or Latin America or Africa or Europe, you largely share the same formal structures by which titles are given, and the possibility of being called a researcher and so on. But of course, the conditions are very different, and this will be one side of the analysis. And then, of course, we never really, these formal structures never really reflect I mean, they are very similar, but they are not quite the same. And this is what I try to, I worked at first on a public university in Jordan, and the structure are exactly the same as the ones you can find in Italy or in Germany, for example. But then you have very different understandings of what could happen. And that book was all focused on this difference between how things were on paper and how things were in reality. And I found these French sociologist and also a close colleague of Pierre Bourdieu, Luc Boltanski, very useful in this regard to express this distance between what he termed reality and what he terms the world. So by reality, he speaks about institutions, and he says every institution, by its own functioning, creates a reality. So tries to say the whatness of what it is, as he puts it. So how things are. Then the problem is that there is always something external to this institution, what he calls the world, which is not to be understood only in social terms. It's also everything that happens, including environmental crises and so on and so forth, that could challenge what the institution poses as a reality. And this discrepancy between reality and the world is what constitutes the possibility of critique. So I don't know if the paper I sent you was circulated among all participants, but in this paper I try to, I will try to summarize it briefly. So the point is, if you're an anthropologist and you want to look at the social conditions of critique, it is better to separate from the, let's say, the hard notion of critique with the capital K, and so the critique that has its own genealogy that many of you know much better than me, and then of course passes through Marx from Kant and even before, of course, and then ends up with the Frankfurt School, and this idea that critique has to condemn dominance and go toward emancipation. Yes, so this understanding that the point is that in many parts of the world, and I work on the Arab countries, so for example, the role of religion does seem to play a role in a different way compared to this hard understanding of critique. Yeah, so for example, Islamic feminism seems to contradict feminism in its classical understanding on the point of emancipation. So what does it mean to be a liberated woman? And Islamic feminists would have a different answer than Western feminists on this particular point. And so if we were to understand feminism from a purely ethnocentric perspective, it would be difficult not to call these Islamic feminists as having a false consciousness. I mean, as basically missing the point. And what anthropologists, or not all of them, but what anthropologists I would like to associate myself to try to do is to try to understand the world through the lenses of the people they study and they speak with. And so one has to understand what in the local contexts, the critique, an anthropology of critique exists since a long time, of course. So for example, when we are confronted with phenomena that we can't really understand, let's say sorcery, yeah, it is very difficult to study them with a condescendent attitude, say, okay, these people don't understand it or believe in unreal things, whereas we enlightened scientists, we know the truth, and so we are able to study them. Yes, this would be a first attitude, which today it sounds a bit patronizing, and but at the time it was already an advantage. I mean, it was already a step toward these people, rather than simply saying they don't even understand a thing. And then, of course, there is the second aspect, that if we deconstruct all the categories that make the hard critique possible, then we are left with relativism. So everything is relative, and we can't really criticize. Who has the authority of criticizing anything anyways? Because we can't really have a firm grasp of anything. And the position I subscribe to refuses both of these accounts and say, yes, of course, we can't claim to have hold of the truth, but we cannot stop criticizing conditions of oppression and conditions of injustice. Of course, this cannot be done in the name of a superiority or in the name of a better knowledge compared to the social actors, but rather this critique has to happen together with the social actors that we study. Now I will give you a couple of examples from one of my latest field of study, which is the university in Egypt. And of course, now I could speak for hours, and I won't, but perhaps you know that the university in Egypt is, first of all, rather old, exists in its modern form since a century. Of course, Al-Azhar exists since over 1,000 years, but the modern form of the university, the one that shares the organizational form, was created a little over a century ago. And it's very widespread. There are a lot of universities in the country, a lot of students, and it's a system that is in crisis since decades. It is said to be in crisis by Egyptians since decades. And so these three categories, that is old, established, it is very widespread and is said to be in crisis, were always very interesting for me, because if you speak with Egyptians who may sit with us in such a roundtable, most of them would immediately say that there is no research worth of this name being done at Egyptian universities, that intelligent minds go elsewhere, United States, Europe, doesn't matter, just abroad, because you can't do research in your own country. And that it is basically worthless to study this institution because it's basically either controlled by political power or corrupted or having lots of problems between, let's say, Islamists and loyalists to the regime. So it's basically impossible to articulate any form of critique in an independent way, because you always find yourself between a rock and a hard place, as they say in English. While all of this, or most of this, is actually true, this does not hide the fact that despite all difficulties, you have universities since over a century, and you have a lot of people working on them and trying to articulate critique. So what I did, for example, in my latest project on doctoral studies at Egyptian universities, was to work with Egyptian doctoral candidates at Egyptian public universities and try to work with them, analyzing the conditions by which the doctoral studies were organized in their own departments, and by selecting some case studies. In our case, it was critical theory, gender, and heritage, and trying to understand the discrepancy between what is produced at local universities and what is produced on Egypt and these teams from all over the world. Now, to come to a conclusion, of course, this doesn't take the issue of domination away, but I would actually still believe that to dismiss everything that happens in such institutions as worthless would be wrong. I mean, these universities perform a social role, and in these universities, you still have the possibility of critique. This possibility of critique is always at a variety of levels. Of course, if we understand critique in its hard form, most of the critique that is produced nowadays in Egyptian universities fell short of our requirements. But this does not mean that there is no societal articulation at these universities. I think for the moment I can leave it at that, and I will then be happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I mean, the distinction you made between reality and word, I couldn't catch the name of the professor you said, the French professor.
Boltanski. I can write it in the chat.
Yeah. Actually, that is exactly where we are trying to go. I mean, the discrepancies, which actually gives us the possibility to level some forms of liberative or emancipative critique. Thank you very much. I am sure we will come back to this very soon. Where is Masturah? Can you see Masturah, Dustin? Yeah? Okay, now the floor is for Masturah.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And thank you, Professor Miri. Thank you, Professor Byrd, for involving me in this roundtable. Can you hear me clearly?
Clearly.
Okay,
Yeah.
I've been having problems with my connection. I have heard some of you in bits and pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my video and speak to enhance the possibilities of a smoother presentation. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. If it is going to help. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Anyway, just to say that this is me. I'm here, and hello, everybody. So now I'm going to go into
audio form.
Yes. Okay. All right. Good afternoon again, everybody. Now, today's topic, well, as I read on the poster, is critical social theory, relocating critical and post-colonial social theory, religion, solidarity, and emancipation. Now, I took a few moments to think about what I was going to speak about today. And I suppose with the relocating, well, you know, it's what we've all been talking about for so long, and it's the idea of decentering critical theory from the center, the European, the Western center. So I suppose the topic it would be, again, to talk about theories of Eurocentrism and, well, religion, solidarity, and emancipation. Now, I have to say that I am not a research academic. I am a writer and a language teacher who teaches in a language center that is affiliated to university, namely the University of Masturah, which is a small town in the Marche region. It's a provincial university, and I will return to this concept of provincial in a while. I'm a journalist. I wrote for a newspaper in Malaysia many years ago. And in Italy, I was part of a press agency. And I occasionally write for Counterpunch and other media. So I'm speaking to you as a writer, as a teacher, and of course, somebody who is interested in scholarship. But you know, I myself am not a research academic, so my presentation will not be on that. Now, I'm also my father's biographer, Syed Alatas, the sociologist, Malaysian sociologist, my late father. And I'm sure all of you familiar here with who my father is, so that I don't have to. Yes, okay. Now, the religion topic of the motion today, of the topic today. Well, you know, my father very early on spoke about progressive Islam, and this was before Omar Safi. And there's a lot of, there can be a lot of research into that, comparing the different stages of how we are to understand progressive Islam throughout history. I mean, it's not just a term that comes with the rise of terrorism in the West, but it was something that was conceived long before that. But I will not be speaking about religion and my father. In terms of solidarity, well, I will, how are we supposed to understand solidarity in today's topic? Does it have to do with, you know, the kind of solidarity that between East and West to solve the social and political problems in the world today? Does it have to do with a kind of charitable or charity? You know, trying to solve the problems of what was caused by colonialism? I'm not sure. I will focus instead on emancipation, and that is the emancipatory thrust or sense of my father's concept of the captive mind. Now, we all know what it is. It's been spoken about a lot. Many academics have written about it. But you see, and of course, he's not the only one to talk about the kind of emancipated, the mind that needs to emancipate itself from colonialism. But when Ngugi wa Thiong'o spoke about decolonizing the mind, he did not tell us what to call the mind that needs to be decolonized. And you know, it's not enough to say the mind that needs to be decolonized is a colonial mind, because well, because we live in a post-colonial period after colonialism. And this is where Alatas's concept of the captive mind becomes interesting, because it helps us recognize, it's diagnostic, it helps us recognize when somebody is captive, whereas the colonial mind, you can see it, it's conscious. You can see when somebody is operating within colonial categories, right? So Alatas's concept of the captive mind is relevant in today's discussion when we speak about emancipation. The question is, why do we need to talk about captive mind? How does it help us understand social problems today? And who is, you know, why do we need it to diagnose a problem? For example, with the current Palestinian tragedy, the Palestinian crisis, we have the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, very well-meaning, saying that Muslim countries need to come together, to be in solidarity to solve the problem. This is all very well-meaning, it is fine. But then there is this sense for those who are listening to this rhetoric that, okay, we have heard this before. Why is Malaysia now speaking up, even though they've spoken up before, of course, and of course, Malaysia has given a lot of humanitarian aid, but you know, why does Malaysia speak up only after a big crisis happens elsewhere? So it is sort of something like what Dipesh Chakrabarti was saying in Provincializing Europe, that there is this sense of being in the waiting room of history. Something else has to happen elsewhere, and then people on the outside or people in the waiting room of history respond to it. So with the critical construct of the captive mind, when we read deeper into words like Mahathir Mohamad's, when we read deeper into his speech, we see that there is a kind of unconscious captivity at work. There is this sense that, okay, the world is talking about it, something else is happening outside, and then we try to join that debate. We're in the waiting room of history, and then we try to make ourselves relevant. Now, without understanding really what Alatas meant by the captive mind, it is difficult to read discourses like Mahathir's and arrive at this this sort of reading of these kinds of discourses. So that is just one way of seeing, of trying to understand, you know, of making the captive mind as a critical construct relevant. I can give many examples. For example, you know, in Singapore last year, there was the Raffles Must Fall movement. Now, when you read it, you immediately see that it is based on the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with imitation. There's nothing wrong with getting inspired by other movements. But then there is this sense, again, that something else has to happen elsewhere before the others in the waiting room of history latch onto it. So this is just a few words to connect the emancipation in our topic's title to the critical construct of the captive mind. Now, I'm going to, how many minutes have gone by? Maybe 7 minutes, 8 minutes?
Yeah, you still have time, go on.
Okay, I still have time. Now, I am going to move on to my work as my father's biographer. And I wrote a small biography, memoir biography years ago. And the reason it was a small book, this was also part of a social experiment. I chose to tell stories about my father that, for example, the odyssey behind the publishing of his book, The Myth of the Lazy Native, a story about him and Edward Syed as well, and other stories. I chose not to do intellectual biography because, in a sense, the social experiment was to see whether somebody else would do it, not a family member, to see whether a Malaysian writer, scholar, journalist, whatever, would take up the enterprise of writing a biography, because it is, again, you know, a theory of creativity, right? The captive mind. If people are captive to something, they won't do it unless somebody else tells them to do it, or unless the inspiration sort of comes from the outside. A lot of Malaysians and Singaporeans started noticing my father's work only after Edward Syed had written about him in Cultural Imperialism. Again, this thing about being in the waiting room of history. Something else happens outside, and then you notice yourselves. So I wrote this small book. And even in the book, I said, well, let me see if somebody else will write a proper intellectual biography. Now, as a biographer, I know that my father's work is bilingual. So you have to look at the writings in Malay. You have to look at the writings in English. You have to, my own archive was incomplete. I was writing from Italy. And I waited 10 years because the book was published 10 years ago. And in 2020, right, I began searching and researching again, and nobody has attempted to write the intellectual biography of Professor Syed, of Syed Hussein Alatas, author of The Myth of the Lazy Native. There's a lot of material. There's an immense amount of material. And if you don't want to do an intellectual biography, do something else. Write a different kind of book. And so to some extent, my question was, and my father's question as well, was satisfied. You know, if you don't, if you're not going to take it upon yourselves to do something creative, then who is going to tell you to do it, right? So I'm going to end by talking about my discussions with my father on Italy, because the biography project began in 2004, 2005, and I had a different book in mind. And with my discussions with him, my trips home, you know, he would ask me to bring back things in translation. Not to bring them back in translation, but things he couldn't find in translation, he would ask me to sit and read to him. There were some essays from Umberto Eco, some essays by Norberto Bobbio, an Italian philosopher, right? His Elogio alla Mitezza, in praise of meekness. He would ask me to bring these things to read to him. And, you know, I would read things like from, you know, Eco, che cosa crede, chi non crede. And his eyes would light up when I would translate it as, well, what do those who don't believe in? He was interested in all these philosophical questions and the idea of meekness, Bobbio's idea, as a social and political value. It has nothing to do with turn the cheek, I was telling my father, but it has to do with, well, when power rests in those who possess the will that does not yield to violence, but is expressed through meekness. That is the value of meekness. It is a social value, a social virtue in the intrinsic and original meaning of the term. So, you know, he would sit there and listen to me translating things from Bobbio, from Eco, and then we would talk about other Italians, Savonarola. He was interested in corruption, not just of the Roman Empire, but in the Renaissance as well. The idea of, you know, the bonfire of the vanities, and I'm not talking about the Tom Wolfe novel, but I mean Savonarola's book burning. He was interested in someone like Amintore Fanfani, who you know, was the former prime minister of Italy, and his writings on capitalism. And you know, of course, he died, and then after that, I thought to myself, he would be very moved by somebody like Carlo Regeni, who died, was brutally murdered. Giulio Regeni, who was brutally murdered in Egypt, and he would think about brain drain. He would think about all these young Italians leaving Italy, learning a different language, studying, you know, studying completely different languages, going, of course, Giulio Regeni is an extreme example of somebody who was brutally murdered in Egypt. He would be moved by this. There was something he was attracted to about this kind of creativity. Even Sergio Leone, you know, the idea of imitating something, but you turn it into something original. So, you know, we are looking at a post-colonial scholar who is admiring something about the West, Italy in this case, but is Italy still the center, or has Italy been provincialized in the sense that, well, I don't know, this is an open question. When we speak of Eurocentrism, do we speak of the United States, Britain, Germany? Where do we locate Italy in the center? Is Italy now a decentered center? I mean, Italian is not the English language. Italian scholars themselves are struggling to get their works noted and being read in translation. But this was what he sort of was interested in and admired, the idea that a nation, a civilization with a small language in the sense that only Italians speak Italian, could produce this body of intellectual and creative work that he himself used and was dependent on. And he reflected back on that onto Malaysia. I mean, how do you create Malaysia, a small country with, again, a big language, right? How do you create that kind of rich intellectual tradition in a country that is both the center and both decentered as well? So I think I'm done. This was just these were just a few reflections that I wanted to share with you on these topics.
Thank you very much, Masturah. It was very interesting, and actually, while you were speaking, I was thinking about what you are trying to say is how can we use critical social theory in action? This is one point which actually came to my mind when you were talking, and the other thing was actually how or why, for example, when we are writing, say, for example, in Persian, in, I don't know, in Arabic, or even in Italian, then we cannot be actually appreciated, or we even in the very country we are writing and reading, nobody will notice. But if that is getting translated, for example, something translated into English, I give you an example, a very, very interesting example of one of contemporary Iranian philosophers. His name is Javadi Amuli. He was actually telling to one of his students, nobody is going to read what we are saying about Mullah Sadra unless what we are saying is translated into English, or somebody is writing about this in English, and then from English it will be translated into Persian. Then we might be actually cherished, or what we are saying, maybe it will be heard. This is a very serious problem. As Sari Hanafi once, when we were with Farid, I think it was a few years ago, he was talking about publishing, publishing in local language and
publish locally and perish internationally versus publish internationally and perish locally.
Exactly. That is, I think, that's a very serious question which we have to ponder upon. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation.
Okay, thank you. Will I have a chance to say something later at the end as well?
Sure. We are coming back.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Thank you. Now we are going to Farid. Farid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Javad. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, well, everything clear.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll just take a few minutes, not too long. So let me just begin by saying that critical theory, for us in our context, I mean, in my context, for example, is or should be understood as decolonial theory. And it has to do with the critique of, the silencing of voices, the marginalization of various non-Western thinkers, actors, even the marginalization of non-Western realities. by which I refer to topics of study, topics of research, which don't get attention. Why? Because the research agenda in the established social sciences don't cover those topics. Just to give an example from my father's work, he was interested in the sociology of intellectuals. And of course, intellectuals is a topic that is widely it's a field of study that emerged in the West. But my father was also interested in the sociology of the opposite of intellectuals, whom he regarded as the fool. So he suggested that we should have a sociology of the fool. We should have a field that studies the fool, because the fool, the opposite of the intellectual. So he's not using the term in an emotional manner. He's suggesting that there is a sociological type, just as there is a sociological type called the intellectual. There's also a sociological type called the fool, and the fool in developing societies plays a very significant role in different fields, in different at different levels, and he was very much concerned with the role of the fool in politics. But you see, because the fool is not an important topic in Western social science, it doesn't appear in textbooks, it doesn't appear in courses, so it's not on the agenda. And we imitate not only what is done in the West, but we also imitate what is not done. So that's what I mean by the silencing or marginalization of not just thinkers, ideas, but also topics. I think Kerstin was referring to how thinkers from the non-West are marginalized, and in the post-colonial project is to revive interest in such thinkers, and I agree. But it's also the topics, the objects of study that need to be identified. But what I want to say is, given, and I guess this is my main point, given that critical theory is decolonial thought, and given that the context of that problem is Eurocentrism, the ubiquity of the pervasiveness of Eurocentrism in the process of knowledge production, literally throughout the world. Given that that is a problem, I think what has happened is that and I'm speaking about the global South, the third world, and in particular the Muslim world, there has been a lack of attention to other forms of intellectual hegemony. Certainly Eurocentrism is a form of intellectual hegemony which is very serious and needs to be tackled, needs to be critiqued, and needs to be transcended. But there are several other forms of intellectual hegemony which we are not seriously addressing in the Muslim world. The ones that I have been thinking about, you have androcentrism, the male bias, where you have the marginalization and silencing of women thinkers. For example, in the history of social thought, we generally tend to ignore the role of women founders of sociology or social thought, that not only in the West, but also outside the West. That's also true. So it is assumed that in the 19th century, when during the formative period of sociology, and in the colonial world, in the colonized world, in the 19th century, you have the emergence of colonized, of thinkers among the colonized, who can be said to be precursors of social theory or political theory. And examples would be M.N. Roy, Ram Mohan Roy in India, Jose Rizal in the Philippines, and so on. But the assumption is that there weren't women who were thinking systematically about society, about colonial society. So, for example, very interesting thinker Raden Ajeng Kartini, who was writing in the early part of the 20th century in Indonesia, in the colonial period, has really not been taken seriously as a social thinker. So androcentrism is a problem. We also have ethno-nationalism, and I can give examples from my own country, but just to make it brief, you have an ethno-nationalist strain, which is suggesting that for example, that the history of Malaysia is the history of the Malays. The history of Malaysia is the history of one ethnic group. The role of other ethnic groups that came to Malaysia or Malaya, came to British Malaya during the colonial period, Indians and Chinese, for example, are not to be given the kind of attention that the role of the Malays should be given. So this is a kind of ethno-nationalism, a kind of nativism, and it's separate from the problem of Eurocentrism. We have sectarianism, which affects which affects intellectual or academic discourse. The most important aspect of sectarianism, of course, is a Sunni-Shiite conflict, which has affected academia. Certainly, I'm familiar with the case of Malaysia, where Sunni academics who belong to the Sunni majority, are either sectarian in their orientation, or they are indifferent, or they don't want to be seen to be involved in correcting the Sunni anti-Shiite discourse, in correcting the Sunni anti-Shiite, at times hate speech, but also problematic constructions of Shiism. So here you find examples of sectarianism affecting academic discourse. You also have state control. We have, and this is throughout the Muslim world, banning of books. In some countries you have blasphemy laws, but frequently you have banning of books. You have muzzling of scholars and intellectuals. So it is very much a practical problem. I myself have been banned on a number of occasions from speaking in Malaysia. The well-known Turkish scholar Mustafa Akyol, he was both the English original and the Malay translation of one of his books has been banned in Malaysia. And he himself, when he came to Malaysia to speak, he was arrested briefly, but he was arrested. He was detained and questioned by the police. And it was said by, I think it was the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia several years ago, in the previous government, that his works were banned because they're not suitable for a Malaysian audience. So we are up against these kinds of problems in many countries in the global south. We also have traditionalism, which is a very serious problem in academia among Muslims. What I mean by traditionalism is it refers to the weight of tradition, the weight that tradition has on the intellect, such that there is the impossibility or the reluctance to critique tradition, even if the tradition may be problematic. So there's this compulsion to cling to the old ways, and in this case I'm referring to the ways of thinking, such that progress cannot be made in terms of critique. The example that I'm very fond of using, because I've been interested in this issue, is the attitude towards a view, attitude towards, this has something to do with historiography. In early Islamic history, there is the report of an event in which the Prophet Muhammad had approved of the collective punishment of an entire Jewish tribe. And I won't go into the background, you know, of what had happened, but there was, you know, the accusation that the Jewish tribe, the Bani Qurayza in Medina, had went against a treaty, an agreement that they made with the Muslims of Medina. And because of that, they were, because of the report that some of the members, maybe a handful of the members of the Jewish tribe, of this tribe, had went against the agreement, the entire tribe of hundreds of men, they say up to 900 Jewish men from that tribe were executed, and their women and children sold as slaves. Now this account has been handed down from generation to generation and is taken to be the truth. Although there are a few, very, very few, we can count them on one hand, Muslim scholars who doubt the authenticity of the story for various reasons, which I can't get into now. But my point is, there's a reluctance to criticize tradition, and we pay for this reluctance because this story, and I would even say it's a myth, has its uses. For example, a few years ago, a Russian Al-Qaeda, it was a Russian ISIS fighter, had told Muslims that Muslims should not criticize ISIS for killing Christians or for killing the infidels, because the Prophet Muhammad himself did it. He killed the men of the Bani Qurayza. So this tradition has been used. So there are many problems in academic discourse, in the religious field, which are due not to Eurocentrism, but due to traditionalism. And we as Muslims, who are interested in the problem of Eurocentrism and critiquing the problem of Eurocentrism, can't avoid the charge of hypocrisy when we're not dealing with other problematic, orientations within our own communities. There's also the issue of culturalism, which again, I think is a serious issue. In culturalism, when you talk about Muslim society, when you talk about Malay society, for example, the culturalist approach is one-sided in the sense that it does not take into account structure, like class, for example, but also in the culturalist approach, when it comes to the study of Muslim societies, there is the idea that there is the problem that Islam, which is an element of culture, is generalized to dominate the whole culture. In other words, the culture is defined in terms of Islam, and therefore Islam becomes the main explanation for social problems. This is what I mean by culturalism. And this is also a problem in academia as far as the study of societies in Muslim countries are concerned. And I think it would probably also apply to other parts of the world. So I guess my point is that that while Eurocentrism is a serious issue, we also ought to be concerned with other orientations that affect that detrimentally affect our academic discourse. Now, I also, I think I'll come to the end now. So let me just say this, and I come back to Eurocentrism. We need, obviously, to continue the critique of Eurocentrism. But as I said earlier, we also need to engage in the critique of other orientations. But when it comes to the critique of Eurocentrism, there is a need not to reinvent the wheel, as it were. There's a need to continuously reconstruct, because we need to remind people about the problem. But we also, and this is what we're not doing, we also need to move beyond the critique towards reconstruction. Reconstruction of ideas, identification of thinkers. Shariati was mentioned, and we can think of many other. I mentioned Cantini. We can think of many other candidates that need to be, whose works need to be revived, studied, translated into different languages, and more importantly, their works need to be, their thought needs to be reconstructed. I mean, we just take Shariati as an example, right? Shariati was such an important personality if you look at the backdrop, of the Iranian Revolution, and the Iranian Revolution was really a foundational event, regardless of what one might think about the revolution. But it was a foundational event, as was the Haitian Revolution, as was the Filipino Revolution in the 19th century. The Iranian Revolution was very foundational. But Shariati has not only been relatively neglected in the West, but even in Iran. Until now, apart from the efforts of a few people, some of whom maybe half of them are here in this roundtable, there's been very little effort to reconstruct Shariati's thought. He is not seen, he's referred to as a sociologist. Actually, he did not have a degree in sociology, but he's often referred to as a sociologist. But you do not have works that reconstruct his social thought. And this is true of many of the other thinkers that we can identify from the global South or the non-West, certainly from the 19th century onwards. I also wanted to say that in the critique of Eurocentrism, like Masturah was saying, many people had been or are waiting in the waiting room of history, both in the West as well as in the East, in the sense that they have or they are waiting to jump onto the decolonial bandwagon, right? And a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Leon Musavi, wrote a very interesting article called something about the decolonial bandwagon. Now, there's nothing wrong with repeating the critique of Eurocentrism. It's important to do that. But what is not right, I think, is to engage in the critique of Eurocentrism as if we are the first to do it, as if we are the first generation to do it, right? You have so many works, and this was noted by Musavi in his article, there are so many works that engage in the critique of Eurocentrism without referring to the scholars from the 50s, from the 60s, who already started the critique and engage in the same critique. So that, I think, is very problematic, because it's not only intellectually dishonest, but it's also inefficient when you are repeating what has been done before, thinking that you have come up with new criticisms or new concepts, and subjecting a generation of students to your work, when actually the work had already been done. So I think it's very important, to be aware of the history of the critique of Eurocentrism, to be aware of the critique of academic imperialism, of the captive mind, of academic dependency, and so on, so that we don't repeat these mistakes. At the same time, the reconstruction is not just to create non-Eurocentric social science, but also to create non-Androcentric social science, non-sectarian, non-nationalist, non-traditionalist, and so on and so forth. And I think if we don't move in that direction, the danger is that we're going to be stuck with the problem of we're going to going to imagine that the only problem is Eurocentrism, because that's what's happening now actually. Umpteen conferences, webinars, seminars, books, publications about Eurocentrism, about the need to decolonize knowledge and so on and so forth, but very little on these other problems. And these other problems, and in the case of Malaysia, for example, and I'm sure this happens elsewhere, it becomes sort of a badge of honor to engage in the critique of Eurocentrism, to have conferences on the decolonization of universities and so on and so forth. The same people who are doing this kind of critique are androcentric, are ethno-nationalist, are nativist, are traditionalist, are sectarian. The same kind of people who are critiquing Eurocentrism. So we really can't make any progress unless we deal with all the problematic orientations that affect academic discourse. Finally, I just want to say that in the spirit of critical theory, our idea is not just knowledge production, but it's also transformation of the world, right? Which means at least three things for me. It means inspiring people, but it also means agitation. It means agitating so that if not ourselves, but other people move to act. And it also means coming up with solutions. It also means coming up with solutions as to how change can be brought about. All right, thank you. I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Farid. Very interesting presentation. As you mentioned something about Syed Hossein Alatas and the concept of food, it's maybe not maybe bad to mention exactly the concept he used, bebalisma. He says sociology of bebalisma. So sometimes we use, for example, concept, maybe it's good to bring even the concept, the author himself, he used it as well, and try to transmit it and popularize it in the English as well. And the question you mentioned actually brought to mind that how can we apply critical theory in Southern societies and not just talk about it and not just, for example, critique Eurocentrism, but other issues which we are now dealing with and now we are living with it, which you mentioned, for example, androcentrism and these questions about sectarianism and many others which have enveloped our society. And I think it's time to talk about this as well, not just talking about Eurocentrism, just at what do you call that, at the theoretical level. It brings in, to my mind, it's actually a joke which they made in Soviet times here. And this is something actually now we are doing it as well. It says one Russian or one Soviet citizen, he goes to America and was looking at the White House with a very big camera. And then the American guy sees this guy is looking very strange, asks, "What are you doing?" With this very heavy Russian accent, he says, "I'm taking photo." I says, "You are Russian? You're from Soviet?" He says, yeah, how do you know?" He says, "You are from that country which is suppressing people, he's killing people, so injustice, whatever political, for example, bad words he could know, he's throwing at this Soviet guy." So he's very surprised, says, "Have you been in the Soviet Union?" The American guy says, "No, I have never been there." Then why do you say these things? He said, "Wait, do you see that guy is coming from there?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "That is the president of America. And do you see these guys, policemen and the secret police? Now I can go there and say whatever I want." So he goes forward and starts to say, "Down with USA, down with imperialism, down with colonialists," whatever he wants. And everybody looks and they go. Then he says, "Do you see? This is America. It means freedom." And he says, "Do you call this freedom?" And the American guy says, "Yes, this is freedom." So, "Okay, I buy for you a ticket. I take you to Soviet Union." Then they go to Soviet Union. He comes to the Red Square and he sees, for example, the Communist Party and the head of Communist Party are coming all together. The Soviet guy says to this American guy, do you see that guy? He's the head of Communist Party. He's the strongest man here. And these are the secret police. Now look what am I going to do? The Soviet guy goes forward and starts says, down with USA, down with imperialism, down with those who invaded, down with those who invaded Vietnam. You see, this is freedom. So that brings to mind, you know, when we are talking about Eurocentrism and critique of Eurocentrism, because it's so far, we critique whatever we want. But when it is coming, for example, to state-controlled universities, state-controlled, for example, media, we don't dare to critique it because it's so close and it is very life-endangering. Thank you very much, Farid. Thank you very much. So now we are going to my dear friend, Michael Naughton. Please, the floor is yours.
Now I will do my heartfelt, sincere gratitude for the invite again. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Syed.
Thank you very much for being here.
No, honestly, I could listen. I mean, this has been fantastic so far. So many thought-provoking ideas. I didn't think I was going to speak next, but I put a little link into the chat. And it kind of relates to what Farid was saying, partly because what's happening even in the UK now is this is at the University of Leicester, and they're setting up a new school for business. And the person who is the Vice Chancellor, who is heading up this new kind of effort to try to, you know, modernize the business school, he's a former colleague of Syed and myself in the University of Bristol. He was Pro-Vice Chancellor at Bristol. He was a professor at Bristol. And it's fascinating how this is, there is a boycott currently being called for of the University of Leicester by the University and College Union, which is the union for all lecturers and professors in the UK. And I'm currently off work because I had some surgery on my shoulder and bicep. But I've been looking at my work's emails. Not one person, no union member, no person who identifies as a critical activist against these kind of things, nobody has mentioned this. And if you look at this call for a boycott at Leicester, there is one of the professors who's being made redundant and sacked from the University of Leicester in these photographs because he is analysing from a sociological perspective. That is his crime, that he simply wants to analyse business and the economy from a sociological perspective. And there is this inherent fear now, and the business school now wants to align itself with business so that it can get jobs for the students. It's about employability, it's about not rocking the boat, it's about staying in line. So it's deeper than colonialism, okay? And I asked to kind of speak towards the end because I thought, my mistake, but I mistakenly thought that some of the speakers today would be more specific about things like Black Lives Matter or the kind of effects of colonialism and be making more of a call for some kind of justice about a specific thing. Because when I think about this idea, about the title that we've been set today, because I'm very good, I always try and stick to the titles, but we're going to steer slightly away from religion, if I may, today. But this idea about critical social theory and critical and post-colonial theory, and I think about that in the context of solidarity and potential for emancipation, I think I have a problem with the whole idea that we even are anywhere near post-colonial theory. In fact, I think that these are just work in progress ideas, but I think that the very notion of post-colonial theory is problematical. I think that the theories that are so-called post-colonial are in effect a response to the harms, injustices, inequalities of colonialism. They're a legacy, a response to that, to try to resist that. But they are not creating, as far as I can see, solidarity. And I think this is something that has already been said. I think that what we see is a more separatist or divisive kind of picture when we start to look at this. And hardly anybody, I don't think anybody, has specifically so far mentioned power and power relations. So some of the questions that we're talking about, I mean, I don't know you well yet, but Kerstin is talking about kind of cognitive imperialism and colonial systems of knowledge. What is she talking about if she's not talking about power relations? You know, this is what we're talking about. And this is what we're talking about at Leicester, and this is what we're talking about when we're thinking about this. And I know in the UK, we're appointing lecturers in universities now, specifically to represent a cause. So we've got this push now to actually have more representation, to demonstrate our, inverted commas, post-colonial legacy. So we've got this, you know, positive discrimination agendas to get more black and brown people, as they're called, okay, into the university. But then when these colleagues come into the university, they are only concerned with promoting, pushing forward the agenda about discrimination, harm, inequality to black people or to brown people, not generally. And I mentioned in the last one that, you know, white indigenous groups or ethnic groups who were kind of affected by colonialism are not part of that conversation. When we appoint like female staff to sociology, they have to be feminists that say that the world is misogynist, it's patriarchal. All of those things are true. But this is not about creating solidarity. It's about creating more and more divisions. It filters through. Farid talked about our students who we teach. It filters through into the students who we teach. So one of the things I say at the beginning of every year to students, it's not very original, is, you know, tell me a bit about yourself. What concerns you most about contemporary society? Try to get a feel for who they are, get them speaking about what concerns them. And the last class I was in was just before COVID. I'm asking that question, and then people identify, you know, as a black woman, as a black man, as a transgender woman. So I say, go on, talk to me. And she says to me, I'm transitioning to be transgender. And the most important thing to me, and what really gives me anxiety, is when people misgender me. I said, well, nobody's going to intentionally misgender you and use the incorrect pronouns. But let me ask you this question. When you were coming in to the World's Memorial Building, this is, you know, the most impressive, beautiful, standout building in the city of Bristol, which houses the university where I work. When you were coming into this iconic building, and you know, which is a gift to the city of Bristol, which derives from the slave trade, which Bristol has close links with, and tobacco empire. When you were coming into this building, which is kind of born out of colonialism and exploitation and stuff like that, what did you think about the people who were in the sleeping bags, who've been sleeping on the steps? You know, they have nowhere to live, they have no food, they're just there, just, you know, hoping that we will give them some money so they can eat today. And she said to me, she said, I didn't even notice them. Where were they? I said, they're lying on the steps. So these kind of people, social structural inequality, poverty, it's become invisible. When we explored it further, the students as a group said, people are in that situation now because of the choices that they made, because of their own bad choices. So I think that identity politics now has played a massive role in disuniting us, in fragmenting us, rather than creating forms of solidarity. And I genuinely think that in a kind of neoliberalist society like Britain, and that's all I can really speak about, is that, you know, it's becoming more and more apparent that there's less and less solidarity and more individualism and less empathy for other people who may be in a social structural problem. And if you are a black person, or if you are transgender, or if you are a woman, but you are a millionaire or a billionaire, the world works pretty well for you. So what we seem to be talking about is relatively poor transgender women or men, relatively poor black and brown people, relatively poor. So we come back to Karl Marx, to me. We come back to this idea that unless and until we can start to identify our class and recognize our class affiliation, right, things are just going to continue to get more and more fragmented and less social solidarity. So I think lots of aspects have been recognized today and already spoken about today that need to be addressed. But I think that overwhelmingly, I think that what we need, and I think that Farid said it as well, about what we need to start thinking about is reconstruction, theories that start to genuinely reunite people or unite people, rather than this continual divide. And I find myself falling into that trap. Like I said to somebody recently, I don't think I'm going to be able to carry on being an academic for much longer. And I've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable as an academic at the University of Bristol for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, because I'm standing overwhelmingly young women, okay, and I'm teaching about gender inequality, sexual violence, rape, domestic violence. They're the kind of things I teach as a man. So now I'm mansplaining. I don't want to mansplain. I have a few black or brown students. I don't want to like blacksplain. I don't want to talk to them about their own oppression and origins of their discrimination. I want, as Daniel was talking about, a more anthropological relationship and conversation where they speak their own experiences and we learn together. That's the kind of experience I'd like to have. And increasingly I say, because I'm not black, because I'm not a woman, because I'm not oppressed in these ways, I can't carry on in this job. So now I start to rely on, oh, I'm a working class guy. I shared a bedroom with 5 people. It was the first up, was the best dressed. I'm Irish. We used to eat potatoes on bread. That's all we used to have for food. I'm starting to compete with these people to show I'm also oppressed. But I don't really believe that. I don't think I am oppressed in those ways. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that, like I said, I think Foucault is really important in teaching us about not just knowledge, but discourse. There is no knowledge without power. So we have to think about Foucault, we have to think about Marx, but that all sounds very Eurocentric. So I don't want to say that, and I learned so much about, well, I've always been learning from Syed personally when he talks about different traditions and different ideas. So that's why I say I only speak about what I know a little bit about, which is what happens in the UK and specifically the southwest of England. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring, as always, what you said about identity politics and especially about the power and neoliberalism. I think most of our critiques, if it doesn't like refer to the neoliberal systems, which actually have enveloped the whole world system today, we might not actually get very far away. So I think what you said about neoliberalism and its extension beyond Western Europe or even America, the whole globe, this is very important actually critique. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now the floor is yours, Dustin.
You're going to regret it. No. When I was an undergrad, I studied jazz. I was a jazz drummer. I got the opportunity to study with Billy Hart, who was Miles Davis's drummer in the 1970s. And so when I was younger, I found that I could improvise a lot better. And now that I'm getting a little bit older and I've just had my 5th child, I find that I'm a classical musician, which means I have to read a paper as opposed to ad lib. So that's what I'm going to do. And if it gets boring, feel free to tune me out there. But my paper's entitled Walter Benjamin's Chess Turk and the Emancipatory Potential of Religion, the West and the Rest. And so, in Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, he offers a perplexing image. A mechanical puppet in Turkish attire with a hookah in his mouth, playing an expert game of chess. Benjamin writes, this automaton is, quote, constructed in such a way that it can win, that it can play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move, unquote. To the outside viewer, the expert chess-playing puppet is an enigma. How can an inanimate puppet outsmart a sentient chess player? Benjamin reveals that inside the table, underneath the chessboard, is hidden a small little hunchback, who is the expert chess player. It is this hunchback who guides the hands of the Turkish automaton and wins over the opponents. For Benjamin, the image of the automaton Schachturk, the chess Turk, which was invented by the German Wolfgang von Kempelen in the 18th century, provides a symbolic image for religion and theology in the 20th and now 21st century West, right? Whereas it explicitly appears that the Turk, understood to be Benjamin to represent historical materialism, is winning the struggle against the opponents, the Turk has secretly enlisted that little hunchback, here understood to be theology. It is theology who is the true genius in the struggle, and historical materialism is the mere facade. Representing theology, the ugly little hunchback must keep out of sight, for theology is taboo in a secular scientific society which no longer trusts religious utterances. For Benjamin, if theology is to engage in an emancipatory struggle again, it must do so through secular historical materialism. So in this brief essay, I would like to ask a couple of questions related to Benjamin's dialectical image. One, is this still true today, that theology must smuggle itself into historical materialism? And two, is that claim true for the Western world? So it's clear that Benjamin's dialectical image, that he sees a role for religion in it, or at least in theology, which struggles to emancipate human oppression. There's still a role for religion in that. A similar perspective was shared by the other members of the first generation of the Frankfurt School. However, for Benjamin, as well as Adorno, Horkheimer, Fromm, Löwenthal, religion's role in such an emancipatory project is not straightforward. They recognize the reality of the Western Sonderweg, as Habermas calls it, the deviant path, which will what Habermas calls the extreme level of secularization in the West, and the problem that causes for active religiosity. Of course, we all famously know God is dead, thus says Nietzsche, and all that is left is the secular life world with mild residues of religion remaining. Although these pockets of religion remain within the post-secular society, religiosity in the West is a mere shadow of its once self. That's not a controversial claim by any means. When I'm the secular philosopher sitting in Rome in the Chiesa Nuova, and I'm the only person in there, you know something's gone wrong, right? So the reality cannot be ignored by the critical theorist, and it will not be ignored by the Frankfurt School, but rather will reside at the core of their nonconformist social theory. So how does one square this round peg? How does one claim that religion has a role in emancipatory struggles and contemporary emancipatory struggles, while at the same time implying that religion is entirely impotent in a secular society? To answer that is our task. From the perspective of the first generation of the critical theory, those aspects of religion that are to survive secular modernity must go through the secularization process. Adorno sums up this claim in his essay entitled Reason and Revelation, writing, quote, "Nothing of theological content will persist without being transformed. Every content will have to put itself to the test of migrating into the realm of the secular, the profane. This migration of the sacred into the profane through determinate negation, wherein the sacred elements of religious semantics and semiotics are drained and transformed into publicly accessible reasoning, is the only way for religion and theology to remain within the struggle for emancipation for the non-identical in the secular Western world." That's the basic claim here. The nearly complete secularity of the West calls for such a drastic measure, as religion in its own skin appears anachronistic, obscurantist, and unable to defend its claims. Indeed, when it does attempt to defend its claims, it does so with the tools of secular modernity, ratio, reason, right? Thus tacitly acquiescing to the reality of secular modernity's already triumph over religion. This is a methodological departure in regard to religion from the Frankfurt School's immediate predecessors, including Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and even Lenin, all of whom called for an abstract negation of religion in the West, as they thought religion remained a recalcitrant impediment, to the full actualization of man's potentials, psychologically, sociologically, politically. The Frankfurt School, rooted within the works of their predecessors, abandoned the abstract negation of religion in favor of a determinate negation of religion, wherein they would return to religion as a concept resource for nonconformist theology or philosophy. They did not want to collapse philosophy into positive metaphysics, which would abandon the hope that Golgotha, the history as Golgotha, would not be the last word for humanity, that the innocent victim would in some way triumph over their murderer. While it was not possible for them to retreat into religiosity, they attempted to maintain the negativity of apophatic theology, negative theology, within their own philosophy. In fact, it was the Bilderverbot, or the image ban, the Hebraic ban on images, that was translated into the concept of the political utopia in the Frankfurt School. That became the driving force, if you will, the core of their negative philosophy. So just as the Bilderverbot stood as the theological grand inquisitor to all that was elevated, all that elevated itself to divine status, whether that was individual or nation, the notion of utopia served as the historical grand inquisitor against all ideologies that posited the end of history via their vision of an ideal society. The unarticulated utopia therefore served as ideology critique. In this way, the core theological ideas of Judaism, and of course in Islam as well, animates the secular philosophy of the Frankfurt School, just as the hunchback of theology animates the chess Turk in Benjamin's dialectical image. Where the Frankfurt School wrote about religion and theology, they did so during the Cold War context, wherein most major political struggles were being fought within the struggle between capitalism, socialism, communism. Even third world liberation struggles were pigeonholed into this binary. This overarching context, as well as their own commitment to certain Marxist perspectives, forced the Frankfurt School to sublate religion into historical materialism, or historical materialism itself, in all its various shades, was the primary force for social emancipation. Today, sadly, historical materialism is fairly weak. It is mostly an intellectual exercise among nonconformist scholars in various political parties, most of whom are politically impotent. Today, we're in what Jürgen Habermas has described as the post-secular society, wherein the secular Western nations have come to realize that religion has not disappeared, as Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and Lenin had hoped it would. Religion remains an important force within secular society, albeit not a determining one. If historical materialism is no longer a force for historical and/or emancipatory change, and religion has demonstrated its capabilities of withstanding the onslaught of secular modernity, or even rebound due to the pathologies of secular modernity, ought we now think about reversing Benjamin's image? Ought the ugly little hunchback step out of the box and reveal itself as the true master chess player? In other words, ought historical materialism now be translated into theological language so that it may enter into the public discourse via religion? Now, bear with me. It's clear that Pope Francis, for example, is not a Marxist, even though he's often accused of being one, but he's not a Marxist. But Pope Francis's own critique of capitalism, the marginalization of the poor, the destruction of the planet, all core elements in historical materialism, has garnished him praise and admiration even from the most devoted of atheistic leftists. Whereas those same leftists most often preach to the crowd, Pope Francis, using explicit theological and biblical language, has brought together both religious and secular voices in his attempts to undermine global capitalism, sex trafficking as well, interreligious violence as well, and to turn the world's attention to the plight of the poor, the refugee, and those who have been left in the ditch of history. Certainly, the Vicar of Christ isn't advocating a revolutionary overthrow of the prevailing political economic system, nor is he going to transform the Catholic Church into a leftist utopia, but he need not be the only vehicle for historical materialist informed religious critique of secular capitalism, neocolonialism, and financial imperialism. But his religious voice is more powerful right now than any secular Marxist at the moment. Another example to consider were maybe, say, the Catholic liberation theologians, who also read the Gospels through the lenses of Marx's class analysis. They too determinately negated Marx and allowed certain elements of historical materialism to be translated into their religiosity, whereupon they critique their own well-entrenched institutions, specifically the Catholic Church, for being on the side of those with the largest battalions, as Napoleon once remarked about the church. Like Pope Francis today, these liberation theologians drew the ire of international capitalists who were invested in social statics that privileged capital and those who owned it over the wretched of the earth, whom the liberation theologians shepherded. With their own openness towards Marxist philosophy, historical materialism's influence within the Catholic Church and Catholic theology, returning the Gospels to the crucified, and not just Jesus of Nazareth, the heavenly Redeemer, as it's understood to be, but also return the Gospels to the very earthly persecuted, those who are oppressed and those who are degraded. After a period of conservative suppression, liberation theology moved the church away from the influence of Emperor Constantine, who reconciled Christianity to imperialist power in the 4th century, and set the stage for a class-conscious theology of Pope Francis. In such a way, the prophetic within Christianity was elevated over the priestly, and Christianity once again took on the revolutionary role it once had within the Roman Empire among the liberation theologians. While it is true that the post-secular condition that Habermas speaks of allows for religious voices to express their discontent with the condition of secular modernity, their voices are still marginalized. Thus, a metapolitical struggle within religious communities is needed, wherein the battle of ideas ought to attempt to bring religious voices back to the initiators of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, all of which shared a critique of class domination, a la Marx, in their own time, albeit in religious language and with definite theological presuppositions. Nevertheless, it is time for both religious and secular thinkers, believers, intellectuals to think about how they can form united fronts against neoliberalism, class domination, exploitation, gender inequality, and other forms of tyranny with the understanding that their worldviews may not find an overlapping consensus on all matters, but can at least agree upon the claim that the world ought to be without such tyranny. Now, and this is the last section. In the 20th century, historical materialism not only determined much of the West, but was a major influence in the Muslim countries, especially those who were either under direct colonial control by Western countries especially especially those nations in Africa, parts of the Middle East, and East Asia. In many of these countries, communist parties participated within their post-colonial governments, and in others, communism became the official ideology of the state. Nevertheless, Arab and Iranian nationalism, which often drew from Marxist sources in their emancipatory struggles, failed to bring about societies that were congruent with Marxist visions of classlessness. Their attempts to suppress religious voices in favor of secular socialist and/or nationalist voices ended without achieving the great emancipation they desired. As a result, the age of native dictators, as opposed to direct colonial control by Western nations, began, and until the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and later the Arab Spring, such an age found very little effective opposition. Here too, I argue that Benjamin's dialectical image can shed some light. It appears to me that in many cases, Islam was not sublated into secular forms of opposition to secular dictatorial states, but was rather suppressed as being somehow either one, supportive of the dictatorial state, or two, hopelessly obsolete, incapable of mounting any effective opposition. While the first claim has plenty of examples within Islamic history and Muslim history, the later is simply untrue, as was shown by the theorists such as Ali Shariati, who, like the liberation theologians, returned to the Shia tradition a consciousness partially formed by historical materialism and its various permutations. He did not follow Jalal Ali Ahmed and others into the Tudeh party, which was more aligned with Soviet-style communism, but rather determinately negated Marxism, the Frankfurt School, and others, and married their class analysis with the primordial Islam of Prophet Muhammad and the long tradition of struggle that has formed the Shia tradition. In this way, he reversed Benjamin's image. Shia Islam was the public image of opposition to systems of oppression, including US domination, the peacock throne of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah, and the political quietism of the clerical establishment. This begs the question, can Islam in the 21st century be the public face of human emancipation within Muslim societies without regressing into reactionary forms of fundamentalism? Or is Islam so tied to its closed semantic universe, typical of religions under assault by secular modernity, that it cannot be influenced by secular emancipatory political theory? Can Muslims rooted within the Islamic tradition struggle for modern, democratic, and anti-capitalist societies, or must their visions of an ideal society end in authoritarian theocracy? While many progressive Muslims and modernist Muslim thinkers argue for the affirmative, most of the Islamic political parties that oppose Western hegemony do so through reactionary retreats into theologically and politically static forms of Islam, as not to sacrifice perceived authenticity for the incorporation of bid'ah or innovation. From my perspective, reactionary forms of political Islamism are doomed to fail, as they are anachronistic, romantic, and even nostalgic for an ideal past that they cannot recover. Such attempts to return to an earlier stage in Islamic history is rooted in psychological need, not a cold assessment of the modern world and the place of the Ummah within it. It appears to me that if the majority Muslim countries wish to be the masters of their own fate, they must, and here I return to Benjamin's dialectical image, sublate emancipatory philosophy into the Islamic tradition, not to remake the Islamic tradition, but rather to reinvigorate the prophetic class consciousness that determined the primordial Ummah, just as Ali Shariati did during the struggle to emancipate Iran from the American and Pahlavi domination. An abandonment of Islam will prove incapable of moving the Muslim masses towards social transformation. Returning to stale forms of religious fundamentalism will make the Muslim world anathema within the contours of modernity. A determinate negation of both into an emancipatory Islamic social theory must be generated. All right.
Thank you very much, Dustin. Thank you very much. The last question actually which you posed, I remember maybe in 60s and 70s, it was very easy to answer yes, that Islam has a very progressive, or we could actually reinterpret Islam very progressively. But after 42 years of revolution in Iran and what has happened, for example, in the region, this interpretation itself needs to be critiqued and needs to be reflected upon. Of course, I agree with you that this is a hope that could actually be achieved, at least intellectually. But the question is, when we take this intellectual ideal or hope into the practice, how can we not how can we not actually get fooled by, for example, those who are coming and trying to say this is the authentic interpretation of Islam? This is, I think, a very, very precarious project which you are actually talking about, and it is a very serious question. It's a very practical and critical question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I enjoy. I am not going to tire you all because you have been now here for almost 2 hours. The only thing I would like to say, it's like what actually I had in mind when I talked with Dustin about this roundtable. We actually choose the title was Critical Social Theory, Relocating Critical Post-Colonial Social Theory. And the three issues of religion and solidarity and emancipation, why they were chosen. By critique, I refer to a position where different perspectives could be demonstrated, relocated. And by doing so, we hope a possibility will arise where suppressed voices could be heard and reformulated and even reconstructed. In other words, post-colonial, decolonial, and even subaltern and alternative forms of conceptualizing the social, or in my view, new forms of doing critical social theory. But the question is what we are expecting from such an intellectual exercise. Are we just trying to talk about, for example, these issues? Is it just, for example, an intellectual exercise? Or no, we are trying to get through these intellectual debates, try to find a way to the reality. We are looking for human solidarity and forms of emancipation under repressive forms of orders or social orders. Here, I think religion could play a significant role. But however, as Dustin mentioned and other contributors rightly mentioned, however, I think the question is what form of religion, what interpretation of religion? Religion could be repressive and liberative, could actually contribute to repression and could be instrumental. For example, in Latin America, we have seen, as Dustin mentioned, for example, in the Iranian Revolution, we could see that it could turn into some kind of emancipative. But at the same time, if it's not critiqued, if the religious institutions and the traditions which Farid mentioned about traditionalism, if these forms are not critiqued, again itself could turn into some kind of divisive, as Michael actually mentioned about some other issues, for example, in England. Religion could itself be another form of actually disuniting or division among humanities. What I mentioned in the beginning, I think Mehdi mentioned about Fanon and Ali Shariati. Fanon was telling that when we bring religion into the struggle against colonialism, post-colonial forms or new colonial forms, it could actually be very divisive. But Shariati, I think, on this question was not very clear, or at least we could say his position was a little bit needs to be critiqued as well, because he was saying to Fanon that the way we are reinterpreting religion, it could be a very uniting form, and it could actually be emancipating. But we see that even the forms or even the interpretation he brought itself didn't succeed, and it couldn't unite. So I think when we talk about religion, we need to be, as Frankfurt School social theorists, they mentioned, we should be conscious about the both aspects of repression and the liberative dimensions. Here, actually, I close my talk, and the floor is open to you. And if anybody has question and Q&A, we will be very happy to accommodate all questions.
Well, let me break the ice.
Yes, one.
I like what Michael said about, the examples of bourgeois nationalism, really. And to me, I'm not sure who came up with the term, but I think it describes the very attempt to divide and conquer, to divide us along race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual preferences, except class. And it seems we've seen repeatedly here. I mentioned that in one meeting I had, they almost killed me because I said, race matters, but we really need to emphasize the class components, the class structure of society, if we are to try to create a united front to accomplish something. If we were to just, in a sort of pathetic way, keep recalling the oppressions of the past, and then of course it makes you all feel good, and then what? Where do we go from this? So what we really need to do is to address the core issues that people can relate to. There is one common denominator that everybody can share, can see themselves in, and that's class, whether they belong. I've had the students, when we talk about racial oppression, discrimination, et cetera, the white student says, what about me? I'm poor. I work 50 hours a week. I'm hungry right now in class, sitting, listening to you. What about me? There is that. And on a global scale, I think you can apply that. You can see that. I think Syed Farid mentioned about the traditionalism and about the division, it seems, or attempt at dividing people exists in every society, whether it be in the metropolitan areas of the West or in the eastern part of or global South. And I think that those mechanisms needs to be identified. And the question is, how do we go about addressing the class without being accused of being Marxist? Well, excuse me, Marx wasn't the only one who talked about class distinction, class analysis, class orientation. They're all, you can find it about just about every philosophical strain and every social analysis, every ideological strain, all of those that we consider progressive. And repeatedly we mentioned about the critical theory. To me, critical theory certainly has the potential, or had the potential, but when we look at the development of critical theory, and that's really my question for you, is that do we really want to relocate critical theory somewhere? Well, let's look at the context. I'm assuming we're talking about the Frankfurt School, right? The School for Social Research, and then critical theory. We start with the first generation critical theorists who start with, hard-hitting criticism of Western, mindset, the structure of society, class, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the second generation. Now, what do we have? The third generation. I am just so sick and tired of hearing about Habermas in the context of Iran in particular. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Habermas is still talking about a social democratic society in which it's open. Things are open for discussion. Whether the direction is proper or not, that's a different matter. But the fact of the matter is that discourse, that discussion is allowed over there, right? At some point, whether they accomplish something or not, that's a different matter. But for me to somehow assume that I can copy that in an authoritarian society, whatever it is, it's really being naive, or in many ways trying to be, it's deceptive, to say the least, to me. But so my point is this, though, again, going back to the identification of cultural resources, and that's why I think it's important, because that's the language that people understand. Yes, absolutely, it's critical in the 21st century to put religious concept in the secular context. Why not, right? Ali Shariati, I think, did a fantastic job of doing that. I'm reading or translating the Class Structuration in Islam. And, the whole notion of a structuration, and, self-society dialectics, the development of a consciousness and awareness, without neglecting the class of society, using your religion, using the existing reality. So I think that there is a need really for emphasizing or going against bourgeois nationalism, regardless of where it appears, but also alongside that, neoliberalism. We talk about neoliberalism in so many different contexts. But what is really neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is simply the supremacy of the private sector. The private sector knows what's good, and it tells the government what to do. The public sector is useful as long as it can serve the interests of the private sector. And so, yes, we can see that in terms of globalization around the world. But so the world should be united against an economic policy that favors one segment of society, a small segment of every society against the rest. So that's really the dilemma. What is to be done now against?
Okay, thank you. I think Mike wanted to say something. Yes, Mike.
This is a statistic that I read this morning. The 1,000 richest people in the UK are worth £771 billion. This is 6 times as much as the NHS budget, 8 times the spend on education. Yet in the UK at the moment, 14 million people live in poverty, and thousands of children are going to bed hungry every night. And this just gets worse and worse and worse. And yet, when you talk about, it was interesting, Mehdi, when you talk about, we'll be called Marxists, right? The power of the kind of anti-Marx discourse is that people who can kind of read Marx, even if, as Foucault said, let's take away the author's name from the front of the book, read the analysis, see what you think. But it's been that discourse has been so silenced, really, that nobody wants to identify as being a Marxist, even within a sociology department, with a Marxist tradition like the one that I'm in. It's kind of, who would want to admit to that? And so there's no such thing as class. We live in a classless society. We only have individuals. We've got neoliberalism social structure, which has created individuals who only think about themselves in that sense. This context for trying to create solidarity, it's challenging, but in a way it's really exciting as well, right? But I think that there has to be this concerted attempt to resist as far as possible, just creating more and more forms of counter-discourse about different aspects of colonial legacy and harm, because that just creates more and more fragmentation, more and more division. And I think that we have to be, or those people who want to be committed to this project have to be more committed to devising forms of social theory that unite rather than divide, because it is divide and conquer. It's as old as time, and it's so successful. And that's what's happened, and that's what's happening all the time. Pitching young against old, sick against healthy. Gay against straight, rich against poor. It just goes on and goes on and goes on, and we fall for it because we're desperate, because people are desperate and they're fighting to survive. And they haven't got the capacity to be able to stand back from the fight for survival that they're involved in and be able to see that it's not in their interest to continue like this. I was just want to say another thing about what Dustin was saying, because I feel very, very lucky to know one of the key liberation theologists in the UK, which is a guy called Bruce Kent. And I'd known Bruce quite a long time. He was a former Catholic priest, and then he was thrown out of the church because he kept interfering in politics, specifically the political policies of Margaret Thatcher at the time. And I read an article about liberation theologists, and Bruce Kent was mentioned alongside Martin Luther King. And I thought, is that my Bruce? I was really pleased to know Bruce Kent. And I think what's fascinating about neoliberalism, really, when you start to analyze it, is just how much it's failing. And somebody I think about when I'm thinking about the current failure of what I would call the corporate mythology or the neoliberal mythology is Campbell. So when Campbell's talking about mythologies and stuff like that, he says that for a mythology, because that's what I think neoliberalism is, for a mythology to be able to survive, this is Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, right? Campbell talks about it needs to have a sociological prospective myth, a psychological prospective myth, and it also has to have a spiritual dimension. And neoliberalism is failing in its sociological prospective myth when more and more people are not being able to sustain themselves sociologically. And the psychological prospective myth is also failing because what we're seeing, especially in this country, is such an increase in mental health. And that mental health, I think, is really sad that individuals are experiencing such mental anxiety and mental distress. But I think in a inverted commas positive sense, as a sociologist, I think it just shows you the extent to which it's breaking down. Its legitimacy is failing the imagination of people because the sociological aspects of it are failing too. So I'm hopeful that, you know, when people are turning to religion, you know, when people are turning to different things to try to fill a gap or fill a void that they know is not being catered for within this kind of neoliberalist mythology, that there is a space for forms of social theory that try to bring people back together. And that's a project worth being involved in, I think.
Very interesting. Thanks, Mike.
You know,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, one point I'd like to make along the lines of what you said. About 15 years ago, we were thinking about, my college is a working class name, we were thinking about inviting Roy Bhaskar, the quintessential philosopher, the founder of critical realism, right? That same college right now is nothing but a bureaucratic pile of, hey, what's in it for me, you know, and top heavy, administratively speaking, and incredibly demoralized student body, indebted, hungry. And so this is the reality. What is the platform by which we can really communicate? You know, I'm thinking that's why religion, I think, is important. I did a chapter of my dissertation on liberation theology in Latin America, by the way. You know, it was fascinating to read that these guys actually told people over there that sin, the concept of sin, means any act that hurts other people. Sin. Now, imagine the usefulness of that concept when you try to talk to people to get them to do something about their own community, right? And then they find a structural sin as imperialism, as colonialism, as exploitation, you see. So the point is that, yes, if we rely on cultural resources that exist there within each community, I think there is hope for emancipation.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Farid, go on.
Yeah, I want to continue on this issue of class and religion. So I think it was Dustin who talked about class conscious theology. Yes.
Yes.
And of course, I find the idea very attractive, but the problem is that those thinkers whose thought present the possibility of developing a class conscious theology, for example, Shariati, or the late Ottoman thinkers, Syed Nursi, these thinkers have been abandoned by the left. So that possibility, can't be realized because they've been abandoned by the left, or they're ignored by the left. In the case of Shariati, he was abandoned by the left. If you look earlier in time, in the late 18th century, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, when Muslim thinkers and activists in the anti-colonial movement were looking at socialism and trying to combine Islam and socialism. I think the Indians were probably the first to do that. They rejected Marx. They rejected Marxism. So there you also have a rejection of, basically of class analysis and of historical materialism. So their socialism was different. So I think there are these obstacles in terms of developing a class conscious theology, and this issue also relates to how we as academics can actually be more relevant, and this relates to the issue of whether Islam is emancipatory or repressive. Of course, it's both, because it depends on how you are speaking about Islam, right? So if you speak about Islam as identity, it's very repressive. It pits one group against another. In Malaysia, for example, Muslims are pit against non-Muslims because the politics is identity. But there is a way to talk about Islam in a way that unites people rather than divides them. So I've been asked to speak several times at a Buddhist temple, not to academics, but to just to the so-called ordinary man on the street. And what I tell them is that if you look at the values of religion, you look at the values of Islam and the values of Buddhism, they are the same. They are common. Don't look at the theology. Okay, in the theology there's a great divide. Muslims believe in God. Buddhists don't believe in a supernatural being. But if you look at the values, that's where you find the commonality. And I tell them that the majority of Malaysians are Buddhists and Muslims. If you think of the majority of Malaysians as Buddhists and Muslims, but you think in terms of identity politics, then you have a divide, right? And the vote for more progressive parties or politicians will be split according to identity politics. But if you look at it in terms of, if you look at yourselves in terms of, a people that may belong to different religions, but you have common values. For example, you have common values against corrupt leadership, for example, right? Then you're going to vote together and possibly vote out a corrupt government. But my point is this: we have the language to talk about these things, right? But we need to talk to people, not just to write articles in our journals and not just talk to students. Of course, that's our job and it's important. But we need to be able to speak to to lend our expertise to people who are not academics. But we then have to be able to teach ourselves to talk in a way that's accessible to them, right? So we need to do what there's a book that recently, well, I'm not sure when it came out, but and I don't. The author is Billig. He wrote a book called something like "How Not to Write Badly," how to learn to write badly, which is a very excellent critique obfuscating terminology and the use of jargon and making yourself unintelligible to others. So I think a lot of academia has become that way. So we can't really talk to people, right? When we should, for example, as sociologists, we should be able to. I think it was Malcolm X who said, tell it to me like I'm a 6-year-old or something like that. We should, if we're not able to, to explain things such that, our grandmother understands what we're saying, chances are we don't really understand it ourselves, right?
Thank you very much. Thanks. Any other question or any other intervention?
Masturah, I have a question for you real quick.
Yes, go on.
Did your dad ever write anything on Savonarola?
Well, he was working. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yes. Okay. He hasn't published anything yet. No. He was working on a book on evil, actually, tracing the origins of evil and connecting it to corruption through the Roman Empire, Renaissance. And he was just attracted to the figure of Savonarola for obvious reasons. The idea of Renaissance being sort of the symbol of high culture, and then you have somebody like Savonarola who burns books. So yes, but no, he hasn't published anything. No.
Great, thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any question or no intervention. Yes, Daniele.
No, I wanted to take up what Syed Farid was just saying, that it also relates to what Masturah said, that this idea that of translations across boundaries. So I know a similar quote by an Italian academics turned politician turns monk, Giuseppe Dossetti, who said something like, if you can't explain a concept to a 5-year-old, then you don't understand it. And and it's but I guess I would like to link back to Masturah. I don't know if you published anything on your father's interest on Italian thought, because I would be very interested in reading.
Actually, it was, it was a chapter in my book, but my publisher said, make my book more relevant to Malaysia. I had a chapter on my father and Italy, so it wasn't, it's not in my book, that chapter.
Okay, but if you can send it to me, it would be a pleasure. And because there is a politics of translation. So, for example, in a country like Egypt, you have the state that has a national center for translations, and in which some intellectuals get actually some funds to publish translations. And not all of these translations are immediately serving political goals. That is interesting. So you can have Arabic translations of Pirandello, for example, which would be a bit outside of the normal narrative on the Arab world, for example. And it's and then these books are sold in Egypt for very cheap price, so a price that is affordable for locals. I mean, there are subventions. And then I also wanted to go. I mean, I share this idea of class. I'm glad that I just I'm part of a project on Egypt and class, initiated by somebody in France, but it involves a lot of Egyptian scholars and scholars from Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And I think it is a very promising field. I mean, very neglected, and to look at inequalities. And then perhaps Michael, if I understood your point, I mean, I'm not sure if you were saying that in order to teach about oppression, you need to be oppressed. I actually think that, that's not the case. And it's actually, I mean, mansplaining, I will be against it also. But if it's necessary, it's actually good that a white male professor says something about male power. And I wouldn't find it disturbing. And I actually hope that I got some criticism from time to time, particularly where identity politics is well inserted in academia.
I think he's gone again.
I think he critiqued you, that's why he's gone.
I pressed, as soon as he started to criticize me, I pressed the ejector button.
Go on, if you have.
I don't think he was criticizing, but I think my point was very tongue-in-cheek that that today, when you're actually, you know, in a kind of context of identity politics, where everybody is trying to, you know, identify themselves and separate themselves from one another, and it's a race to the bottom. You know, it's a race to who is the most harmed, who is the most oppressed, who is the most disadvantaged or exploited or whatever. You know, you think, how the hell can I talk to these people unless I'm also kind of joining in that? Oh, you're back. Hello, Daniele.
Yeah, I apologize. I keep crashing.
It's okay.
Yeah, me too. It happened to me too.
But it was more a comment about the and about the cultural context of universities in Britain today, where people are just encouraged all the time to just keep exaggerating and amplifying their individual oppression or consequences of oppression. So people who are, you know, really middle class and went to private schools, they'll say, well, my great-grandfather, he was oppressed, so it's in my DNA, I'm oppressed, right? And everybody has to keep publicizing it all of the time. And everybody's a victim, right? So everybody's a victim and somebody is to blame. And you just think, that was all.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you very much.
You know, there's something connected to this that it has come up in my own work. You know, I come from a Midwestern American family where you have to step, you know, just one generation out of the family, not even that, and to find tons of racism, right? Sexism, homophobia, the whole thing. I mean, we all have the uncle, right? That's like that. And so you always would hear from them, well, these people don't belong here. This is our country. They're not of us. They're the others. They don't belong here. And then you start to see now in universities and in college campuses where those who were othered are now othering themselves, right? I don't belong here. I'm not of you, right? And what I always found in the class I teach called Civilization Studies was to say, hang on a second. Our origins, at least in the American context, are from all over the world. I mean, I'm Anglo-Frisian, right? But, you know, you get people from East Asia, you get people from Africa, they're from all over the world. And yet somehow, whether we like it or not, we're Westerners. Regardless of where we came from, we are now Westerners, which means you become the inheritor of this language. You became an inheritor of multiple languages. You become the inheritor of the Greco-Roman world. That doesn't mean it's all great. Doesn't mean it's all good. It's not, clearly. But you're the inheritor. You are of the West, even if you came from somewhere else. And so I spend a lot of time in Rome. And one of the things I like to do in Rome is talk to the Bangladeshis. I love Bangladeshi. They're beautiful people, but they're all over Rome. And, you know, you ask the Bangladeshis, like, where are you from? And they'll tell you all about their home village, their home culture. It's beautiful, you know. And they're like, are you planning on staying in Italy for the rest of your life? Yeah, I don't want to go back. I'm going to stay here. You know, I support my family back in Bangladesh, but I'm going to stay here. And then it's like, really? Like, what, who are you now? Have you become Italian? Have you appropriated that Greco-Roman inheritance as your own? And there's always this, no, it's not me. That's not who I am. I'm Bangladeshi. And it's like, can you be both? Can you be a Westerner and Bangladeshi at the same time? And I think that the narrative that you brought up is one that enforces either on one side from the European racist European side that said, no, you can't. And then some of this identity politics on the other side is doing the same thing. No, you can't. Well, you can. I mean, in many cases, we're the Willensgemeinschaften people in the West now. You know what I mean? We're the willed people, right? We're not the Volksgemeinschaft, and we saw how horrible that can be when we attempt to be that, right? So, I mean, that's part of the struggle that I think that I don't see being articulated very often among academics. It is the particularity of where you come from, but not where you're at now.
And there is a concept by one of the Iranian Sufis, Shah Nematullah Wali. He says we need sheikh who knows at least more than one language. For example, we need sheikh who is multilingual, that can speak to different people in different traditions. What we need now maybe are people like that, not, for example, just knows one language only, or only one book.
Yeah. Por voi io imparerò.
Exactly.
For you, I'll learn.
I don't know if Kerstin wants to say a few words, and after you, maybe I just have one tiny request.
Yes, Kerstin.
Yeah, actually, because Michael and Dustin brought it on, you know, as white academics, and how do we deal with our privilege? And from a post-colonial viewpoint, I suggest seeing us as, of course, privileged in that sense, and self-critically evaluating that white privilege and openly discuss that with students.
Yeah.
And when you're aware of your white privilege, that's the first large step that you take. And Michael, you're so far, you just want to stop, you know, being in that place. But on the other hand, I think people like you too, and myself, we should use our privileged position to bring decolonial education, bring ideas of decolonizing the academy, decolonizing sociology, decolonizing our, you know, relationships among human beings, and bring that into the university and into discourse. Because if you step down from your privileged positions, fine, you don't know who's going to be hired. Let's be practical. And the next person might not even think twice about all these issues. So use your position and keep doing it, and keep that discourse open, and discuss class privilege, race privilege, cultural privilege, and these things, and think about decolonization, and how do we decolonize the classrooms, like bring non-white discourses, non-white thinkers into our classrooms. And I mean, there's a hashtag, cite Black women, right? Just Black women as an example, basically. But, you know, bring theories and critical thinking by non-white people into our education and discourses. And that's the position that I see myself in my task. And another thing might be also, you know, speak less and you know, give your place to someone else. I mean, I've been invited to speak as an expert on something, right? And then I'm thinking, maybe in Germany, it's just an example. I mean, can you talk about, you know, German colonialism in Cameroon and Nigeria and blah, blah, not Nigeria, Namibia. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but I want my colleague who's from Cameroon, I want her to be with me in that talk, right? So, you know, share that privileged space when you speak, and maybe also write less, and, you know, try to facilitate non-privileged people to write and gain a voice in terms of publication, and kind of in that sense, you know, distribute decolonial thought into academia. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Kerstin. Yes.
Okay,
Masturah.
well, yes, I just have a tiny request. Since we're all talking about language, and we're all teachers, and we're writers as well, I invite all of you, all of us, to use the word captive in our writing and with our students as an analytical category, as a critical construct, because it's not just a simple adjective in the English language, but when we start to use it as an analytical and critical construct to deconstruct political discourse, social discourse, you know, we scrape away and we see the hypocrisy. We, when we use it, we really see what people are dominated by. So I invite all of you to start using it more. So-and-so's discourse is captive. That work of art is captive. This action or position is captive. That demonstration is captive. Once we start doing that, then we really, it works as a critical construct. It works as a term, you know, and it helps in the analysis. You know, when we see an old woman in Gaza saying, I am older than your state, that is not a captive statement. It is a statement made by a woman who is in prison in occupied territory, but that statement is not captive. Yet, when we listen to Mahathir saying things like, oh, we have to come together and be in solidarity, or that instead is captive, even though it is masked as positive discourse. So this is why I say that language, as all of you are saying, is important. Please start using mental captivity, captive, as an adjective, as a critical construct. Bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think.
Can
Yes.
I quickly say,
Yes.
I also want to issue an invitation
Yes.
to you, especially to those of you who are privileged and based in the West. One thing which I feel you can really do is to help to dismantle some of the structures of neoliberal education. And it has to come from you, because the problem is we simply imitate the regimes. We simply imitate the regimes, the ranking regimes, for example. We simply imitate it, and it's destroying our education system. You know, for example, the ranking regimes, right? We're required to publish in the ranked journals, which are, I don't know, 85% or 90% are in English and are published in the US or in the UK. And the ability to communicate to write academic papers in your own languages becomes diminished. And that's just one example. And it's really ludicrous that our academic career in our own countries depends on the extent to which we are recognized outside of our countries. Nobody cares, about whether you're recognized within your country by people who write in your own language. That's unimportant. What is important is that you're recognized by people who are writing in English and published in ranked journals. This system can only be dismantled by you, right? Those of you who have white privilege, because when you reject the system in your own institutions, and in the future, it might be the distant future, these systems are then dismantled. We will then start to imitate. But right now, we're not willing to not follow these systems because we're too much academically dependent on these institutions. So you can use your privilege for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, actually, we're running out of the time. I give the floor to Dustin to conclude the seminar.
So I'd like to thank you all on behalf of Olivet College and the Humanities Department for coming here and engaging in such an amazing discourse on a very important issues and other permutations. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope to see you all someday in person, in wherever it is in the world, but we can drink brotherhood and sisterhood together.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Hope to see you soon.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.